Hi, folks. You're listening to the Paranormal Peep Show with myself, Andy Chaplin, and Neil Geddes-Ward. Neil, how are you doing?
Hi, Andy. Well, I'm actually quite hot at the moment. It's kind of been sticky hot, but that's good because it means that we can go out and enjoy the weather and actually soak up some sun. For people that have been trying to pay to go abroad, I think they're not allowed to go abroad now. So at least we're getting a bit of the sun to keep us nice and warm rather than pay to go abroad to have it. Are you getting enough sun?
Yeah, a little bit too much. I reckon a couple of days ago, it did get very intensely hot in the UK. It's now cooled off a little bit. So I've been outside, beer gardens, drinking a little bit now that the lockdown has eased slightly. I actually found myself in a beer garden making random friends, drinking a bit of beer and kind of exchanging beers for mini readings, just for fun, really. So people give me their objects like watches and rings and necklaces, and I'd do readings and get beers in return. And I tell you, I got mightily sloshed this week.
Well, how did you sort of tell them, by the way, I'm going to do a reading? Did it just start with one snowball?
I'll tell you how it went. I went down in Ware, which is my hometown,
Yeah.
and it was just to have a lunch with a friend, actually. So she was going back to Italy, and I didn't even know she was in the UK, but she was, and she said, "Do you want to come and meet for lunch?" So we did. Went in there, and there's a girl there working on her laptop, and she said, "Oh, I recognise you. You do the psychic fairs, don't you? The psychic nights in the pubs." And I said, "Yeah, I do." And she said, "Oh, I love all that." And we got chatting. She came outside. We got chatting, and she said, "Anything you could pick up for me?" And so I started picking things up, and then those fatal words, "Do you want a drink? Can I give you a drink?" so she gave me a drink, and then she called her mum and on the phone, and I gave a phone reading, and her mum paid for like more drinks, and then her kind of like partner turned up, and he wanted to go, and he got me drinks, and then it was just person after person, and the beers came, and I just read to the point where it's weird, even though kind of like I was quite tipsy and quite drunk, I could still actually kind of carry on reading, which is really interesting, because you think if you get drunk, you wouldn't be able to contact spirit, and you wouldn't be able to keep reading, but I did. I would emphasize, I do not support people getting blind drunk and going out and doing paranormal things or readings. This was just a circumstance in my life, but I certainly wouldn't advise it for other people.
Yeah, it almost sounds like a cue for a Carry On film. Carry On Reading.
Carry On Spirits. Yeah.
Yeah,
well, I mean, I have
reading.
heard this theory. I've heard this theory that the spirits drinks, as in kind of vodka, whiskey, blah blah blah, spirits, were called that because the shamans of old used to actually get blind drunk in order to channel spirits and entities and things, and that's why they're called spirits. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but it's interesting. If it's not true, I'd like to know why drink spirits are called spirits.
Yeah, that is a really good point, actually, because you can kind of see how that it might relax you a little bit, but then you've got to do it as a fine point of relaxation. Obviously people here meditate and stuff like that, but maybe in those days there wasn't really the facilities to meditate. But then again, they used a lot of these drugs as well to get into these altered states of consciousness and stuff.
Ayahuasca and things like that.
Yeah, taking mushrooms or something, leaves or whatever it might be. I mean, that's just where I'm talking about. I don't know.
Yeah, so I've had after 6 months. I'll tell you what, Neil. After 6 months of literally nothing, just tedious kind of. It would either be going for a walk, sitting down and doing coding, going to the supermarket, and that was my life for 6 months. It got so boring, and to just kind of go out and just sit in a beer garden and relax a little bit, and it was so good.
Yes, I must admit, I actually did go out and have a beer with my family. Drove up to meet them and met my brother and his wife, and then met my other brother and his wife at another pub some weeks later. So it is quite nice to get out, but it looks like it's all going to get shut down again for whatever reason.
I don't think they can. I don't think they can go into full lockdown in terms of how they did in March, because I don't think the economy would last. I think we would absolutely self-destruct. So I think what they're going to do is regional lockdowns, as is happening now. So we've got some parts of the north, Leicester, and other parts kind of locking down. I don't think they can go global. If they did, it would absolutely destroy everything. But you know what? Maybe that's their plan. Maybe there's a dark force that wants this,
And it's interesting also during this time of lockdown, I've been seeing lots of information about the the Pentagon supposedly releasing more information to the public shortly about what information they hold on UFOs.
Oh yes, yes. I've got a keen eye on this. Yes.
Yeah, so that's actually tonight's discussion that we're going to be talking about as well. So maybe we'll cut across a little bit of that information because tonight's guest, ladies and gents, and paranormal fans, we have Steve Boucher from Canada. Hello, Steve. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
And how are you, Steve?
I'm doing great. And
Great.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the Paranormal Peep Show. So you're in Canada. Now, I think we have spoken to some people from Canada on another show of ours, the Apollo Detectives. So, but it's nice to actually have someone on the Paranormal Peep Show talking to us from Canada. And now, which part of Canada are you currently in?
I'm in St. Catharines, Ontario, and that's about a 20-minute drive from Niagara Falls.
Wow. So is that just over the border from the United States, roughly?
Yeah, I work in Niagara Falls on the Canadian side.
Right. So it must be pretty loud, actually, having Niagara Falls outside your window to go to work. Is that right? Is it really loud? Well, that's sort of water going down in the chute.
Well, we don't really hear it, unless you go close to the falls,
Wow.
Have you ever been there, Neil? I've been there. It was amazing, beautiful place.
Yeah, I mean, I've never been there, but it looks a fantastic place. I did see some photographs where it all froze up once at some point. I can't remember what year it was, but it looked really weird. Frozen Niagara Falls, but yeah, lots of people go over there in barrels and things like that. That's when you need a lot of spirits in you, I think.
Yeah, I've never experienced the type of cold that mankind can experience as I have in Canada. I went, when was it? 1998. I've been there twice, 96 and 98. And 98, I went in I think it was about -20 outside. Yeah, that's cold.
How do you cope with that cold weather, Steve?
Well, at some points it's pretty brutal, but we manage okay. There's colder parts of Canada than Ontario, up around Saskatchewan and Alberta, and in that area can get really cold. But generally here we're used to it, and I've kind of grown up with it, so it doesn't bother me so much. I just don't like shoveling the snow,
No, I mean, it gets pretty thick out there, I'd imagine. Now, St. Catharines, that is happens to be a place I know of. I've never been there, but I know of it because I am a fan of the band Rush, and I know that the drummer, I have to say the late Neil Peart, because he passed away in January of 2020. The drummer of Rush, Neil Peart, passed away, but he comes from St. Catharines.
That's right. And I have a little bit of an interesting story about that, because years ago, when my band, the band that was abducted, we actually played backup for Neil Peart at a concert one time. When this was before he joined Rush. And we played on a flatbed trailer in this park called Cave Springs Park. And so we were the opening band for Neil Peart's band, and that was just before he left for Vancouver, and he did that kind of sabbatical ride out to Vancouver, and so anyway, and there was one time that I actually went to his house to look at a car he had for sale. He had this black Lotus Europa, and it was all fiberglass, really low, really interesting looking car. And it was, he had it on for $3,000 he wanted for it. And I wondered why it was so cheap, because, usually a fiberglass car like that is pretty expensive. So I went to check it out, and it was a nice looking car. I asked him if he could start it up, and he said, okay. And when I opened the hood and looked in, it was squirting oil out all over the place. And I thought, I don't think I'm going to buy it, But if I had bought it and replaced the engine or the gasket or whatever, it would have been worth some money today, I imagine.
Wow. Yeah, your dollars could have helped him buy his next drum kit or something, or someone's dollars did anyway. So that's an interesting background story there. Was you a
Yeah.
fan of Rush yourself, or was you not really bothered about Rush?
I like them quite a bit. I like Xanadu. That was one of my
Oh
favorites.
yeah,
And,
yeah. That's in a really prog rock phase of the 70s.
yeah, living in the limelight and stuff like that.
Yes. Yeah. Sadly, they're not sort of they're kind of demised, obviously, with Neil Peart retiring and then passing on. There's not really the Rush now that we, if they did come back, it'd be with another drummer or something, I'd imagine. But anyway, I digress. So tonight, then, we're talking. You mentioned it earlier, actually. You talked about with the band that you abducted. So that's a bit of a clue because you've got some interesting UFO experiences to share with us. So it's up to you, Steve. Where do you want to start? I mean, do you want to tell us about your background first of all? The kind of work you do, whether you had an interest in this field prior to this abduction, or was it a complete surprise? You start where you want to start, really.
Okay. Well, I think what I'll do is I'll start with kind of leading up to how all this happened, how I now have it in my conscious memory, and it started back in 1981. I guess was when I first got my flashes of memory that there was something unusual that happened to me, and so I was in a bookstore one day and I found Bud Hopkins' book Missing Time, and so I bought that book because I was kind of curious when I started to get these flashes of memory. And after I read the book, it triggered something, and I started getting more and more flashes of memory. And I remembered an incident that I had with my dad back when I was, I'd say probably around 4 or 5 years old. And at the end of the book, there was a paragraph where Bud had said, if you have any memories of anything that happened that sounds like the incidents in this book, and you'd like to have them investigated, you can write to this address, and we'll put you in touch with somebody that can research it for you. And so I thought, well, I think the first step would be to ask my dad what he remembers of what I was remembering. And so I went to him and sat down with him on the couch, and I started talking to him about this book I was reading. And I said I had some flashes of memory, and it was about when I was around 4 years old, and I remembered I was sitting next to him in the car. And we were coming back from somewhere, I think, in Owen Sound, and that's about a 3.5 hour drive from St. Catharines. We used to live there at the time, and I'm not sure where we were coming back from, but there was just the two of us, and I climbed over into the back seat. And back in those days, the cars had a kind of a flat shelf behind the back seat, and a little kid could climb up on there and lay down on this shelf. So I used to do that and lay down, and the window would kind of curve over top of you so you could look up and see the stars. And so I was doing that. I was laying on this shelf looking up, and I noticed that one of the stars was moving. And I thought that was kind of unusual. And I felt almost like it was communicating with me, like it was aware that I was watching it.
So, sorry, Steve. At that point, it just looked like a normal star. So it was just the same size, the same brightness, and the same color.
Yeah, just like a white light, but it was brighter than the other lights.
Yeah.
And it was getting bigger.
Okay.
So I wasn't sure what it was, but it was getting quite big. Mm. And when it started to get big enough, I realized that it was coming toward us. So I climbed back over into the front seat, and I asked my dad, I said, "What's that light out there?" And he said, "What light?" And I said, that light. And I pointed out through the window. And by this time, it was matching our speed and following us over top of the treetops. And when my dad saw it, he kind of went into instant panic mode. And he started accelerating to try to outrun it. And I said, "What is it?" And he said, "You shut up, leave me alone." And, you know, he was visibly upset, and I could see that. And so the light kind of flew ahead of us, and it started coming down in the road in front of us. And so he had to stop the car, you know, because we would have crashed into it if he didn't. So he stopped the car, and it was, it lit up the whole road, it lit up all the trees. They were pine trees on both sides of the road. And it came down and it landed in the road, and it was just sitting there in front of us. And so my dad, he was pretty shaken, but he managed to get himself under control. And he looked at me and he said, "I want you to stay in the car. Under no circumstances do you get out of the car. You stay here." And he said, "You stay down low so they don't see you." And he said, "I'm going to go and see what they want." And it kind of surprised me that he was actually brave enough to want to do that, considering how scared he was just a few minutes ago. And so he said, "You stay here and don't look over the dashboard, stay down low and wait for me to come back." And he got out and he started walking toward the ship. And, well, when you're 4 years old, you can get away with quite a bit, you know. And I didn't listen very well. So I was peeking over the dashboard, and I saw two beings get out of the ship, and they walked over, and they were standing in the road. And my dad walked up to one of them, and it looked like they were talking. And I was watching this, and I was very curious. And the beings looked different than we do. They at the time, I wasn't sure what was different about them, but they were definitely different from us, and they had some kind of uniforms on. And I wondered
sorry, Steve, were they like the typical greys, or were they different from that?
Yeah, they were typical greys with the large heads and the large black eyes. And the eyes kind of curve up the side of the head a little bit. So I couldn't maintain my curiosity anymore. And I decided to go out. I wanted to see who these beings were and if I knew them. And I wasn't afraid of them. So my dad heard me get out. I got out through the driver's door, and I started walking up behind him slowly. And he put his hand behind his back, and he started motioning for me to get back. And I couldn't see the being because he was using his body to shield me, so the being couldn't see me coming, you know. And gradually I got closer and closer, and I came up behind him, and suddenly the being that was talking to him kind of quickly moved his head sideways and looked at me. And then he looked back at my dad, and I heard him in my head say, "You seem to be concerned about the child." And my dad said, "Oh yeah," he said, "that's my boy." And he kind of laughed, and then he turned to me and he said, "I told you to stay in the car. Now you go back and get in the car and stay there and wait for me." And I said, "But I want to see," you know, I was kind of excited about this. And so I heard the being say to him, "Would you like my crew member to take him back to your vehicle for you?" And my dad said, "No, that's okay. We have to go. My wife is waiting at home. We have to get going." And so the being looked at the crew member, and he immediately walked over to me, took me by the hand, and walked me back to the car. And my dad was kind of dumbfounded. He just was standing there in the road, looking back at us, watching this being taking me back to the car. And I could see that he was very uncomfortable with that idea, and he wasn't very enthusiastic about it at all. But the being took me back, and I got back in the car, and he got in the car beside me in the driver's seat. And I could see my dad standing with the other being, and they were talking, and then they started walking around the side of the ship. And the being that was with me, he put his hands on the steering wheel, and he looked at me and he said, "What does this do?" And I said, "Well, that makes the car go this way or that way." And I pointed right or left, and he said, "Oh, I see." And he pointed to the pedals on the floor, and he said, "What do these do?" And I said, "Well, that one makes the car go, and the other one makes it stop." And he was asking me all kinds of questions about the car. And then he pointed to the radio, and he said, "What does this do?" And I said, "Well, that's a radio." I said, you can hear people talking on it, and you can hear music on it." And he said, "Oh," he said, "Can you talk back to them on it?" And I said, "No, it doesn't work that way. It just works one way." And so he basically kept me entertained and babysat me while my dad was being abducted. And so I looked up, and my dad and the other being were gone. And this being sat with me and kept me company the whole time. And I was enjoying his company because he was taking an interest in me. And that's a big thing for a 4-year-old, you know. Most adults don't pay much attention to them. And so he said, "What do you do during the day? Do you go to school?" And I said, "No, that's next year." So that's how I knew that I must have been 4, because I was going to start school at 5 in kindergarten. And so he kept talking to me for quite a while, and kept me amused. And then after a while, I noticed my dad coming back out with the other being. And the being that was sitting next to me said, "I have to go now." And I said, "Well, can't you stay a little bit longer?" And, you know, because I was enjoying his company. And he said, "Well, maybe for a minute." And then the other being with my dad looked at him and nodded his head. And he said, "Now I do have to go." And so he got out, and he passed my dad in the road coming back, and went and joined the other being, and they both went on to the ship. My dad got in the car, and we watched them take off, and they went back over the trees. And then my dad started the car, and we started heading home again. And he was very quiet. And then something weird happened at that point. Now, I'm going to say that as I described this to my dad, what I had remembered, he had remembered everything up to that point. And we were both shocked that he remembered all this. And he said, "I remember putting my hand behind my back and motioning for you to get back in the car." And so the one part that he didn't remember that came out under hypnosis later was that they came back a second time. And they did the same thing. They came down on the road in front of us, and just one being got out. And my dad, I heard him kind of mutter, "Oh, what the hell do they want now?" And then they came over to the car, or the one being came over to the car, and he motioned for my dad to lower the window. And back in those days, the windows had cranks. You had to crank them down. And so he cranked the window down, and the being, he said, "What is it?" And the being said, "You forgot these." And he reached in and handed him his glasses. And so my dad took his glasses and put them on, and thanked the being, and he walked back to the ship, and then they took off again. So that was the one incident that happened when I was 4.
So when you had that incident at 4 years old, did you not feel any fear from this strange being in the car with you?
No, none at all, because I was kind of used to different people. Sometimes my parents would go out for an evening somewhere, and they'd leave me with a babysitter, and I'd try to keep the babysitter entertained while they were trying to keep me entertained, and so I was kind of used to that.
And when they spoke to you about the radio and the accelerator and the pedals and things, was it all telepathically through your mind?
Yes.
And you didn't find that strange at the time that you could hear their thoughts in your head?
Not really. I didn't really give it much thought. I could understand them clearly, and I think I answered them with my voice, but when they'd ask me a question, I could hear it in my head. What it feels like when you're on the other end of telepathy like that, it's kind of like when you're reading a book and you're seeing the words and you're hearing them in your head.
Mm.
And when you hear them in your head, whose voice do you hear them in?
Yeah, it's your own voice, isn't it?
Well, I'm not sure. You hear the words in your head, but I don't know if it's actually even a voice, but you hear it and you understand the words.
Yeah.
And you know that they're not your own, that they're coming from. It's a lot like that.
That's reminiscent to me, and Andy would understand this, of clairvoyance, psychic communication with spirit, because Andy and I are both into the mediumship type of stuff, hence Andy talking about his readings earlier. And you could relate to that, Andy, couldn't you?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this is exactly it. It's words that you get in your mind that are not your own words, but it may actually be in your voice, or it's as if you're saying it, but it's not you that's saying it. It's a weird way of kind of trying to describe it.
It's difficult to describe.
And did your dad ever talk about what happened to him on the craft, or does he not remember that?
He did later on, after I had my case investigated. He recalled a lot of the stuff. Well, he recalled everything I recalled. And when he went on the ship, he said that they had shown him, it was like some images that they put in his head that were like a museum of technology. And it showed all these different machines from the beginning of history right up until the very advanced machinery. And it was like a whole history of technology that he was seeing all these things. And I'm thinking that they actually were downloading this into his head because my dad formed this. Well, he was a millwright by trade. He worked on machines, and he also was a welder. And he was an inventor. After that, he got this inventive streak where he started inventing things. And I have kind of got that same inventiveness. And we both worked on two inventions together one time. One was an internal combustion engine that my dad had invented, but it actually had two shafts. And when I came into it and looked at what he had and examined it, and that, I found a way to fold it in half so that it only had one shaft, but it did the same job. And and the other invention was a device used for making homemade wine to replace the normal demijohn way.
Mm-hmm.
And I wrote the application for the patents on both of them, and we got both patents. It took about 3 years for each of them, but we got the patents.
So they've become manufactured pieces, these demijohns and things?
Well, they never went anywhere, unfortunately. I had a guy contact me once about the engine. He was interested in it. He was a philanthropist that invested in racing. He was in the racing field, and he was curious about using that engine, and he wanted to see a prototype, but we didn't have a prototype. So he said, well, if you get a prototype, let us know. But all we had was the theory of how it worked and drawings. And the wine bag, which was a flexible bag that we came up with for making homemade wine in, that didn't really go anywhere because a lot of these people that make homemade wine are old Italians and Frenchmen that have been doing it the same way for years, and they don't want to change. You know, they figure if it works, then why change it? You know.
Yeah, yeah.
So the purpose. It sounds like maybe the purpose of these beings visiting your dad and yourself is to kind of spur on maybe creative thinking or inventive thinking. Would you say?
I think it's possible. It's, at least in my dad's case, I think that.
And what I find interesting, what year would this be approximately?
I'm sorry?
What year would this be?
Oh, well, I was about 4 years old, so I guess that would be around 1959.
Right, okay.
1960.
And you said they had kind of uniforms on, which is interesting. What can you remember much about the uniforms?
I remember them two different ways. I remember them being kind of silver uniforms, and other times I remembered them being like dark blue, navy blue uniforms. So there were different times I've seen them. You know, I've had several experiences with them. And but anyway, to get back to the investigation, I wrote to Bud Hopkins and told him what my dad and I remembered, and he called the house about 2 weeks later, and it really surprised me because I thought that I'd get a call from an investigator nearby in MUFON or something like that, but instead he called me himself, and he wanted my dad and I to go up to Manhattan in New York City, where he had an art studio. He was also an internationally acclaimed artist. And my dad couldn't go because he had to work, but I had some vacation time coming up. And so I jumped at the chance. And it was because it was exciting. It was the first time I ever went on a flight somewhere. And so he invited me up to his studio. He said, my studio is a fully furnished apartment. And so you'll be comfortable there. There's a bed there. And he said, I won't be there, but my friend Ted Blocher will pick you up at the airport and give you a key, and he'll get you settled in and give you a roster of what I was supposed to do, which involved 3 hypnosis sessions with Dr. Clamar that did the sessions in his book Missing Time. And he wanted me to go and see a behavioral therapist that had no idea that I was an abductee. He was sending her people, and he didn't tell her what they all had in common. He just said, it was kind of a blind study where he said, you see what you can find out that they all have in common. And so I went there, and she gave me a number of different tests, an IQ test, and the Rorschach test with ink blots and stuff like that. Basically, she was trying to rule out that I was crazy and that I wasn't doing this for attention or anything like that. You know, she wanted to kind of screen me to see that I was on the level, but she didn't know what I had in common with the other people Bud was sending her. And when she finally found out at the end of the study and he told her, she couldn't believe it. She was shocked because she said that like she didn't even know that UFOs and aliens existed, so it was a big surprise for her.
Wow.
But she did find some things that we had in common. And some of those things were that she said that all these people seem to not be very secure in their own skin. They're some of them have been abused and have trouble in relationships, and they're kind of insecure. So that's basically what she found out, that we all seem to have in common. And then I went for 2 hypnosis sessions with Dr. Aphrodite Clamar, and she brought out a whole bunch of information started coming out in these hypnosis sessions, mainly about the abduction of my band back in 1971 to 73. We had some abductions back then. And those, the ones that involved my band, I'll get into that in a minute.
Mm-hmm.
But Bud had to do the 3rd session himself because she was sick for the 3rd one, but Bud had a key to her office, and she allowed him to take me there and do the hypnosis session himself. So he did the 3rd one on me. And then a lot of stuff was coming out about this being that was the leader of the group that abducted us. And I called him Rigel. But anyway, it started out where back in 1971, we had played at a house party in Vineland,
Mm-hmm.
which is about 15 minutes drive from St. Catharines. And we'd already played a gig earlier that evening in Niagara-on-the-Lake, but at the end of that gig, the drummer said, a friend of mine has invited us to come and play a gig in Vineland at his house party, if you guys are up to it. If you're too tired, that's fine, but he said if you're up to it, he asked if we could come and maybe play a set. So we agreed to it, and we drove to Vineland, and we went to this house. We went in and set up our equipment in the living room, and there was a pole lamp in the corner of the living room. It was kind of a spring-loaded telescopic pole lamp. We had to take that down so we could put the drums in and
Mm-hmm.
set them up. And we played a set. And at the end of the set, as we were packing up our stuff to leave, a guy approached us. And he was a young guy, about around the same age as the rest of us. And he had long hair and a blue jean jacket and denim pants. And he said, "Are you guys headed to St. Catharines?" And we said, "Yeah." And he said, "Is there any chance I could get a ride with you?" So he was kind of drunk, we said, "Why do you need a ride?" And he said, "Well," he said, "my friend was supposed to meet me here and he didn't show up. And I don't know anybody here. And, he said he would give me a ride home, but he didn't show up." So we didn't want to leave him stranded. And we said, "Okay, you can ride with us." And so he got in the back of the van, and we were all piled in there with the equipment and the drums. And it was just a cargo van with one side window on the one side. So he sat in the corner, and there was the guitarist driving, the drummer was in the passenger seat, and then we were all sitting on the equipment in the back. There was myself and the bass player, the guitarist's girlfriend, and the hitchhiker. So we're driving to St. Catharines, and the entrance to the highway at Vineland was closed. So we decided to take the service road back and get on at the next junction. So we started taking the North Service Road, which runs along the south shore of Lake Ontario. And there was this restaurant further down on the service road, kind of a fancy restaurant. And as we were approaching this, all of a sudden the driver stopped. And we said, "Why are you stopping?" And he says, "Well, you better take a look at this because you're not going to believe me." So I looked over the seat, and in the middle of the parking lot of the restaurant was this saucer-shaped craft, and it had lights all around it. There were what looked like searchlights, little searchlights on the bottom of it that were kind of moving back and forth over the pavement. And we were staring at this thing. This must have been about around 3 or 4 in the morning by that time. And he said, "What do you think it is?" And I offered a suggestion that, well, maybe it's a prop. Maybe they're making a movie. And he said, "Well, why would they make a movie at 3:30 in the morning?" And so we didn't want to go past this thing. We decided that the best thing to do was turn around and go back, and we'd take the back roads home instead of taking the highway. So just as we're about to turn around, we started moving forward, and we're heading toward it. And I said to the driver, why aren't you turning?" And he said, "I am turning." And he said, "Look." And he had the steering wheel turned as far as he could to the left, and we were just moving straight toward this thing. And so I said, "Well, put on the brake." And he said, "I'm trying to." And he was pumping the brake, and nothing was happening. We weren't stopping. And at that point, I realized that I couldn't feel any bumps in the road like you normally would when you're driving. And we were going toward this thing pretty fast to the point where I was bracing myself for impact because I didn't know if we were going to hit it or not, you know. And when we got up to about 20 feet from it, we came to rest on the road again. And everybody was yelling in the van. We were all yelling and trying to, we were in a panic. And so the drummer, he was sitting in the passenger seat. He turned around and he kind of became the voice of reason. He said, "Everybody just shut up." So we all just went quiet. And he said, "I don't know what this is, but if we all just remain quiet and stay low and not talk, just be completely quiet, then maybe they'll leave us alone." And so we didn't have any other plans, so that's what we decided to do. And we just sat there. And then I heard the drummer whisper, "Oh no." And I said, "What's happening?" And he said, "They're getting out." And I said, "I want to see." And he said, "No, don't, stay down." And I said, "Well, what do they look like?" And he said, "They're just little guys." And I said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah." And then they came around the van. We had all the doors locked, and I could hear them trying the doors, trying to open them. And I was panicking at that point because I thought, if they get in, I've got to have something to use as a weapon. So I grabbed onto the mic stand, and I thought, if they come in, you know, I might have to defend myself. And so while we were sitting there, I saw in the side window, I saw this head go by the window, one of the aliens' heads, and his eyes curved up the side of his head so that he could actually look inside the van from a 90-degree angle.
Crikey.
And so he went around the back of the van, and we heard them trying the doors. And the hitchhiker had been kind of quiet all this time. He hadn't been saying much while all this was happening. And then he suddenly looked around at us, and then he reached over and grabbed the handle of the back door and opened it. And I was shocked that he did that. I couldn't believe it. Why would you do that? And there were 3 beings standing in the road. And one of them in the front immediately came in. He came up into the van, and I was trying to move, and I couldn't move. I was paralyzed. And I was looking at his eyes, and I could hear him in my head saying, "We're sorry, but we had to temporarily paralyze you because you were thinking of thoughts of violence against myself and my crew. And I was concerned about our safety." And he said, "We don't want to hurt you. We just want to run some tests, and then you can be on your way." And he said, "I need 3 people." And he looked at the bass player. He said, "You." And then he looked at the hitchhiker, and he said, "And you." And he looked at me. And when he looked at me, I looked at the floor. I didn't want to look at his eyes because I could hear him when he was looking at me. And as long as I looked at the floor, I couldn't hear him. I was blocking him out. And then I looked up at his eyes. I couldn't. It was so tense that I just looked up at his eyes, and then he said, "And you." And he said, "Would you follow me, please?" And he turned around and he started to leave. And as he was leaving, his foot got caught in the snare drum stand and knocked it over. And the snare drum rolled out the back of the van. And one of the beings immediately picked it up and started looking at it. And so the hitchhiker got out, and then the bass player got out, and I got out. And I had my bag of instruments, my recorders, with me. And I didn't want to leave them behind in the van, so I brought them with me. And when I got out, I came face to face with the being that was holding the drum. And he was looking at me, and I was looking directly into his face. And this thought came into my head like, "Oh my God, are you ever ugly?" At that point, he turned around, he turned his head around, and he didn't want to look at me because I was assuming that he felt embarrassed. But I wasn't sure at that point whether he was thinking that thought about me or I was thinking that about him, you know? And so when I got out, he handed the drum to the leader, and the leader looked at it, and then he said, "Is this yours?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Who does it belong to?" And I said, "It belongs to our drummer." And I pointed to him in the passenger seat. And he gave me this dirty look, like, you know, he really didn't want me to point to him. And so the leader said to the other being, "Go and get him." So he went around the side of the van, and I guess the drummer cooperated with him and got out, and they came around the back of the van. And the leader handed him the drum, and he said, "Is this yours?" And he said, "Yeah, it's mine." And he says, "Is it damaged?" And he looked at it and he said, "No, it doesn't seem to be damaged." And he just put it on the floor of the van. So at that point, the drummer became one of us too. And so now there was myself, the bass player, the hitchhiker, and the drummer that were going with these 3 beings. There were at least 3. So they lined us up on the side of the van, and the one being the leader, he said, "We're going on the ship now." And he said, "When we go in, we're all going to move as one unit." And he said, "When we start to move, don't look to the left or the right, just keep looking at the back of the person in front of you. And when we go up into the ship, don't touch the hull. So he told us all to turn to the left, and he went and stood in the front of the lineup, and one of the other beings stood in the back. And the drummer was in front of me. And so we all started moving as one unit. Like we weren't walking, we were just kind of, it almost felt like we were standing on an escalator or something. We were just moving. And I got curious and I glanced to the left for a second and we stopped. And as soon as I faced forward again, we kept going. And I started thinking, oh, that's how this works. So then I looked to the right purposely and to see if the same thing would happen, and it did. We stopped again. And then when I faced straight ahead, we kept going. So we all kind of moved over toward the entrance to the ship, and we tilted on an angle. And there were stairs, but we weren't walking on the stairs. There was an archway that I could see dim lights inside the craft. And as we started moving up through the opening in the ship, I couldn't resist it. I had to touch the hull. So I reached down and with my ring finger, I just barely grazed the top of the surface of the hull to see what it felt like. And it felt like warm. It felt like it was aluminum or something like that. And it looked like it had been spot welded, to a frame of some sort. And there were portholes in it that were recessed. And below the portholes was a row of red lights that went around the perimeter. So as we were going in, the drummer bashed his head on the archway, and we immediately stopped. The archway was made for these little short guys. It wasn't really made for a big, tall guy like our drummer. And he banged his head, and so the being turned around and said, "Oh, are you all right?" And he said, "Yes, I'm okay." And so then we kept going in the ship. But before I forget, I just want to tell you that on my ring finger where I touched that ship, about 2 weeks later, I had a huge planter's wart on there that covered the whole pad of my finger. And it took me weeks to get rid of it.
What do you think was going on with that?
Pardon me?
What do you think was going on with that? What caused that, do you think?
I'm not really sure, but I think possibly radiation from the surface of the craft, or maybe some kind of protective field that disrupted the cells in my finger. I don't know. But anyway, once we got inside, the three beings separated us all from each other. And I ended up with the leader, who is the being that I later came to call Rigel. And he was the leader in, I think, pretty much every abduction or visitation that I had from these beings up until about 1976. And they seemed to stop around 1976, the physical visitations. But anyway, he took me over to this area inside the ship where there was some benches. And he said, we'd like you to remove your garments and pile them in a pile on the floor here in the corner. And there wasn't really a corner, it was round. But he said, you pile them on the floor here, and you can put your bag on top of them, because I still had the bag with the recorders in them. And so I put the bag, I did that, and the other people were taking their clothes off as well, except for the drummer. He was very adamant. He said, "No, I am not doing that. You're not going to make me do that." And he argued with the being that was with him. I could hear them arguing, and when I looked at the being, I could hear him trying to convince him to remove his garments, and he said no. So anyway,
So, Steve, just to cut in, when you say you heard them arguing, presumably you only heard the drummer's voice, because if it was telepathic, you wouldn't hear the being's voice. Is that correct?
Correct. But when I looked at the being, I could hear him.
You could hear
in my head.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah. So anyway, the being finally gave up trying to convince him, and I heard him say, "Will you at least stay with us until the others are done?" And he said, "Yes, I'll do that." And they were standing by the archway. So the hitchhiker, I remember it surprised me that at the time I didn't realize this in the first hypnosis sessions, but I found out later there was somebody amongst us that had long underwear on, and I couldn't figure out who it was. And eventually it came out that it was the hitchhiker, because the Canadian UFO Research Network, who took over the case later, they interviewed all the members of the band, and nobody was wearing long underwear that night. So it had to have been the hitchhiker. And so they took me over to this area of the ship where there was like a countertop that followed the contour of the ship. It was kind of arched, and it had drawers and cupboards in it. And they had me go and sit on this. And I said, "Can I keep my underwear?" And the being said, "What is underwear?" And I had to show him. I had to pull the strap on it. He said, "Yes, you can keep that." So he had me sit on this countertop, and I was sitting there in my underwear. And he said, "I'll be right back." And he walked over to this other being that had kind of a metal tray that rose up from the floor, and on the top of it had a towel. And he was unwrapping the towel, and inside that towel there were instruments that looked like dental instruments or surgical instruments of some sort. And he was talking to this other being. And so I was thinking at the time, I've got to get something, because nobody's going to believe me. And I thought, what can I take? And I reached down and I felt the knob of the drawer of the cabinet I was sitting on. And I wonder if this will unscrew. So I started turning it. And sure enough, it was getting looser and looser. And I was pulling on it and turning it at the same time. And I managed to get it off. And I had the knob in my hand, and I thought, well, what am I going to do with it now? I don't have any pockets to put it in, or, where am I going to put this thing? So I just held it in my hand. And so the leader came back to me, and he said, "We're ready to do the test now." And then he kind of tilted his head a bit, and he looked at me, and he said, "What have you got?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "You took something." And I realized then that you can't hide anything from these guys. They know exactly what's in your mind. So I opened my hand up and I showed him, and he took the knob out of my hand and studied it, and he said, "You can't keep this." And the other being that had the instruments on the tray said, "Why not let him keep it? What harm can it do?" And he looked at the other being and he said, "We can't let them keep anything. We're not supposed to let them keep anything." So
that's interesting. When they say we're not supposed to, so they're obviously acting under orders. Did you ever find out who's giving the orders and why?
No, and I wish I could have, but I was thinking of them as soldiers for some reason, because inside the ship it kind of looked like sort of military like. It didn't look like fancy or anything. It was very plain and military like in appearance. And there was a couple of star maps on the wall and these cabinets. And so anyway, he came back over to me and he brought this gurney over with him. And it was like a chrome gurney. I didn't really notice if it had wheels, but it moved. And he brought it to me and he said, "Would you climb up onto this, please?" So I shifted over onto it, and he pushed me over to this other part of the ship. And then they brought the tray over with the instruments on it. And there was one thing on the tray that looked different from all the other instruments. It looked like a handheld unit from a contemporary phone. It was kind of a black rectangular shaped object. And he picked this thing up, and he held his arm out, and he turned it on, and he said, "I'm going to show you what this does." And when he put it on his arm, he was wearing kind of like a lab coat, and I could see through the lab coat. I could see through the skin on his arm, and I could see the bones, the skeletal structure. And then he said, "Now I'd like to try it on you." And he said, "Would you hold your arm out, please?" And I said, "Is it going to hurt?" And he said, "No, but you might feel a little tingling sensation." So I put my arm out, and he put this green light on me, and when he put it on my arm, I could not only see the bones, but I could see the muscles, I could see the veins and the arteries, and I could see my heartbeat pulsing under the skin of my arm. And I was really amazed at this thing. I'd never seen anything like that before. And he said, "Now we'd like to use this instrument to look in your stomach." And he said, "Could you lay back, please?" And so I laid back on the cot, and him and two of the other beings kind of crowded around me, and they used this instrument to look in my stomach. I don't know what they were looking for, but they looked for about for a few minutes or so, and then he shut it off, and he said to me, he said, "I want you to look at this." And this light was on the ceiling that was kind of like concentric circles, and it came down and it was over top of my face. And he said, "I want you to look at that, look right into the center of it." And he turned it on, and these concentric lights were kind of strobing toward the center. And it was sort of disturbing, but at the same time it was calming me, and I felt myself getting sleepy, and I looked away from it. I said, "I don't want to look at that thing." And he said, "No, it's important. It's very important. Keep looking right at the center of it." So I kept looking at the thing, and all of a sudden I was out like a light. And when I finally came to, the being was rolling the instruments up in the towel again. And he said, the one that was with me said, "I'll take you back to your clothes now. We're done." And so he brought me over to the bench, and he said, "You can get dressed." And the other two people were there as well, and they were getting dressed. And so we were all getting dressed, all except the drummer was still standing there by the door with the other being. And so the being that had the instruments came over and stood next to the leader. And the leader said, "We have a little bit of time now. If you want to ask us any questions, now would be the time to do it." And so one of the guys said, "Where are you from?" And he said, "Well, do you know anything about the stars?" And we all said, "No, not really." And he said, "Well," he walked over to the star map and he pointed to some stars on the map, and he said, "We're from this area here." He said, "It probably won't mean much to you, but that's where we're from." And then the next guy next to me, he said, "Do you have any bases on Earth?" And they said, yes. As a matter of fact, there's one right out here. And he pointed out toward Lake Ontario. And then when he came to me, it was my turn. I had been thinking about what I was going to ask him. And I thought, I'm not going to ask him any of the typical questions that other people probably ask every time. I'm going to ask him something different. And when he got to me, I said, what is the true religion on earth? And he seemed to be shocked that I would ask a question like that. You know? And he looked at the other being, and then they looked back at me, and he said, why would you ask us a question like that? And I said, well, you guys are a lot more technologically advanced than we are. And you're also probably more socially advanced. And so I'm assuming you're more spiritually advanced as well. So if anybody would know what the true religion on earth would be, it would probably be you guys. So he said, well, he said, are you a member of a religion now? And I said, yes. And I said, is it the true religion? And he said, no, there is no true religion on earth. And he said, that's the end of the questions. And I said, well, wait a minute. I said, you can't just say something like that and just leave it without explaining. Can you explain more? And he said, no. He says, that's the end of the questions and answers. He says, we probably told you too much already. And he wouldn't elaborate. So I was disappointed because I wanted to know more, like why he would say that. And so as we got dressed and they brought us over toward the exit, the drummer went down, and then the other two guys went ahead of me. And I deliberately waited for the others to go. So I was the last person to leave. And just as I was about to go down the steps, the leader put his hand on my shoulder and he stopped me. And he said, wait. He said, I want to talk to you a bit more. And at that point, I blacked out again. I just lost consciousness. And when I came to, I was standing on the pavement outside the ship, looking up at the leader standing silhouetted in the doorway with the light in behind him. And I could still see these big black eyes staring at me. And he was telling me something, and he was telling me directly into my subconscious. I could hear his voice going into me, and it was like waking up from a really incredible dream. And I was trying to remember what he'd been telling me, and it was like trying to catch a dream that was drifting away, and I couldn't remember, but I was focused on trying to remember what he told me. And at that point, he drifted down into the parking lot and he came over to me and he said, wasn't there something you wanted to show me? And I was still trying to remember. And I said, what? And he said, there was something you wanted to show me. And then I remembered that if I got the opportunity, I wanted to show him my recorders. And so I took them out. I took out one of the, I took out the tenor, the biggest one. And I started to play a little bit for him to show him what it sounded like. And I have that very recorder here in my hand right now. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to play you a few notes so you can see what it sounds like. Yeah, so I played him a little bit like that, and then I handed it to him. And he took it, and he was looking at it. And he did something that really surprised me, that I wasn't ready for. He took it and brought it up to his face, and I thought he was going to put it to his mouth to try and play it. And instead, he put it up to his nostrils. And he blew into it a little bit, and he got a couple of sounds out of it. But I was shocked that I wondered, why did he put it up to his nostrils? Why wouldn't he put it to his mouth? And I got the answer later on when the Canadian UFO Research Network took over my case. They showed me an alien autopsy report that was written by Leonard Stringfield. And in that report, it was a gray alien that was being autopsied. And it said that they have only one organ that does the same job as the heart and the lungs and the liver. And the mouth is just a pocket that basically stops at the throat. They don't have a connection between the mouth and the lungs. Only the nose has a connection to the lungs. So that explained to me why he put it up to his nose, because I'd been wondering about that question for years. You know?
Yeah.
And when I read that report, it answered it for me.
Wow.
So anyway, I was standing there talking to him and showing him the recorders, and my face was itching. It was cold and it was getting close to winter. And I went to scratch my face and I realized it was soaking wet. And I thought, oh, I've been crying for some reason. What was I crying about? And it must have been what he was telling me when I started to come to. And all I remember of what he told me at that time was that he'd given me some kind of a mission. He said that I'll know when the time is right. I'll remember it. And he said that you'll be a big help to your friends and family when that time comes. And that's all I could get.
Do you think that time is kind of now?
I believe it's now, yes. So
and do you know what the mission is?
Well, I'm not sure what the mission is, but I think part of it was writing this book that I just finished writing. And it's called Beyond the Extraterrestrial Firewall, An Experiencer's Point of View. I've just sent that in for publishing.
Okay, that's great. We're going to take a break now. So join us in part 2 of the Paranormal Peep Show, where we'll be talking more abduction experiences with Steve Boucher.
Demons Dwell, The Tower, is a thrilling novel of supernatural terror by Irene Allen Block and Mark Johnson. A hidden evil torments a young couple in a small Italian village along the Mediterranean coast and threatens to destroy their once peaceful lives. As the dark forces close in around them, hope arrives in the form of 2 paranormal investigators. Using their psychic abilities and research experience, the pair quickly finds themselves embroiled in a 100-year-old mystery involving satanic cults and terrifying entities. As they confront the evil forces around them, the investigators are drawn further into the dark and mysterious world hidden beneath the seeming tranquility of an ancient Italian village. Demons Dwell, The Tower, is now available on glenattai.com, amazon.com, and barnesandnoble.com.
Imagine no longer being tied down to your computer, but having the freedom to take live talk radio with you anywhere you go. TalkStream Live introduces our first ever iPhone application. The talk shows you follow now follow you, and your iPhone is now the fastest and easiest way to stay connected to the best talk radio on the internet. Listen to live talk shows 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. TalkStream Live, now available in the iTunes App Store.
Ooh, come in. Sit down, relax, and enjoy the show.
Welcome back to the Paranormal Peep Show with myself, Neil Geddes-Ward, and Andy Chaplin. And our special guest is Steve Boucher, talking from Lake Ontario area, that's St. Catharines in Canada, about his experiences with the alien greys being abducted with his band back in the 1970s. And we heard a wonderful testimony in part 1 about how his band was taken aboard this craft on the way home from a gig. and they were examined by these beings. And I think we've actually got a little bit more of that to cover, haven't we, Steve?
A little bit more, yeah.
Okay, well, please go ahead and carry it on.
Okay, so after I had the conversation in the parking lot with this being, and I showed him my recorders, I put them back in the bag, and I was ready to head back to the van, and he said, "Would you like me to take you back to your vehicle?" And I said, "No, that's okay. I'll go." And I said, "But am I going to see you again?" And he said, "Yes, you will see us again." So I started walking back to the van, and when I came around the back of the van, the doors were open, and I looked inside, and all the people in the van looked like they were all in suspended animation. They were just frozen. And as soon as I climbed in, they all came to life again. And the drummer had been talking to them. And when I got in, he said, "There's something that I need you to agree to." And I said, "What's that?" And he said, "Well, we've all decided that we are not going to tell anybody about this incident." And I said, "Why?" I said, "People should know. I said, "No, I'm not going to agree to that." And he said, "Well, we've all agreed to it. And if you tell anybody, we'll all just deny it and you'll look like an idiot." And I was really upset. Like, that just really upset me when he said that, because I thought, no, people should know about this, that these things do happen. And then I noticed something strange, is that the hitchhiker was not with us. And nobody seemed to know where he went. He just disappeared. And that kind of made me wonder if maybe he was planted on us specifically for the purpose of opening the back doors of the van to let them in.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, we decided to leave, and we watched the ship leave first. It started to head out toward Lake Ontario, and we watched it getting smaller and smaller. The light was getting smaller as it went out. And then we drove home. And I had been wondering what happened to the hitchhiker. And I thought, it's pretty cold out there, and there's still a long way to walk to get to St. Catharines, so I don't know what's going to happen to him. But through the ride home, I kept hearing the voice of these beings in my head saying, "You're going to forget this. You are going to forget everything." And I was having a mental argument with them, saying, "No, I'm not going to forget. I will not forget that this happened." And so when they finally got me home, dropped me off at my house, I went in. My parents were already asleep, and I went into the kitchen and I made myself a sandwich. And then I got a pencil and paper, and I started to write down in point form all the events of throughout the abduction. And after I finished writing them all down, I tore the paper off the pad and I put it in the top drawer of my dresser, and I went to sleep. So fast forward about 33 years, and I went to the Alien Cosmic Expo in Toronto. Well, it was in Brantford at that time. They moved it to Toronto later. And I decided to go public with my story. And I'd been holding on to it for over 33 years, and keeping my real name out of it. It had been published in several journals, including the MUFON Journal, the QFON Bulletin, and Flying Saucer Review. And I met up with a guy at the Alien Cosmic Expo named Mitch Fillion, and he had a filming company called near-death experiment. And he wanted to do a video of me after he heard my story. And so he came to my apartment here in St. Catharines with his dad, and he brought a bunch of filming equipment with him. And he filmed me here in my apartment for about 2 hours. And then afterwards, he edited the film into 3 parts and uploaded it to YouTube. Well, when it hit YouTube, it went viral. And it now has over 2.2 million views, wow. Almost 2.3 million. And so anyway, I started getting emails and letters from people all over the world that had watched my videos. And one of them that came in was from a guy who just called himself Alexander. And he claimed that he was the hitchhiker that we picked up that night. And I was shocked that this guy, he said he'd watched my video, and he said when I mentioned the part about the alien tripping and knocking over the snare drum stand, he said that's when I stood up. And he said I knew then that I had to contact you. And so I had quite a bit of conversation with this guy, just texting. He refused to meet me in person. When I tried to go to his Facebook page, he contacted me through Facebook, and I wanted to send him a friend request. And when I went to his profile, it was a completely blank profile. There was no picture, no friends list, no timeline, nothing. Just a blank profile with his name. And so I sent him a friend request, and he told me later that he didn't accept my friend request because he said, I've had other experiences since that one, and I'm being watched by the government. And he said, I don't want to get you involved in this. And so it sounded kind of clandestine to me. I wondered, like, what's this guy doing, you know? So the first thing I asked him, I said, what makes you think that that you were the hitchhiker? And at that point, he started to describe a conversation that we had back in the back of the van, where he had been trying to pick up the guitarist's girlfriend. And he was drunk and kind of obnoxious at the time, and the guitarist was getting really irritated with him. And I had completely forgotten about that. But when he told me, all of a sudden I started to remember it. And I said, yes, I remember that. And there were certain elements of the conversation that was unmistakable that it was him.
Mm-hmm.
And so I asked him, the first question I asked him was, were you wearing long underwear that night? And he said, yes. He said, my friend was supposed to meet me at this party. And he told me that they were going to have a bonfire in the backyard. And because it was very cold, I should wear long underwear. So that answered the one question of who had the long underwear on. And then the next question I asked him was, why would you open the door and let them in? I said, we were shocked when you did that. And he said, I could hear them in my head asking me, would you please open the door? Could you please open the door? And he said, they were working on me. And he said, I just reached over and opened the door. And then I asked him, I said, what happened to you later? I said, when we got back in the van, you weren't there. And he said, I stayed on the ship. And I said, you stayed on the ship? And he said, yeah. He said, because I was trying to pick up your guitarist's girlfriend, and he was really angry. I could see he was getting really irritated with me. He said, I was kind of afraid to go the rest of the way with you guys. So I asked the beings if they'd take me home. And he said, and they agreed. So he said, I stayed on the ship. And I said, well, we watched the ship head out over Lake Ontario. And he said, yeah. He said, they took me out there, and he said, I had a more conversation with them. And apparently they showed him the base. He says he believes they showed him the base under Lake Ontario.
Wow.
So I don't know whether to believe that part or not, because he said, I believe they showed me the base. But he was pretty drunk that night. So, you know, it's hard to say. But they did drop him off at his house, which was further down the coast of Lake Ontario. He lived near the end of Geneva Street, near the beach. And apparently when they dropped him off, other people woke up and saw these lights outside, and they looked and they could see the ship outside dropping them off. So he said his neighbors actually saw them dropping them off. And he said a few days later, we were talking about it with the neighbors, and they were asking questions about it and stuff like that. And he said a few days later, a black limousine pulled up to his house. And he said it was one of the strangest looking cars he's ever seen. He said it looked like an old black limousine, but there was no logo on it of a make or manufacturer. And he said it was just a blank black limousine with the windows darkened out. And he said two guys got out of it. They were kind of rough-looking, tough-looking guys. He assumed them to be government. And they came over and they threatened him and his dad and said not to talk about UFOs anymore, not to talk about that incident, or there'd be trouble. And he tried to argue with them, and one of them twisted his arm, and he agreed. He said, okay, I won't tell anybody. That's what he told me anyway. And he said, so after that, they left, and he said, we didn't talk about it anymore. But he had some other visitations, which he told me about, and that's all described in my book. And
right.
Yeah, so anyway, that answered some of the questions, like what happened to him that night, where he disappeared to. And now he's kind of blocked me. I can't get a hold of him again. I tried to find his profile on Facebook, and there was about 6 or 7 profiles with that same name, and they were all blank profiles. Mm. So I think he was trying to throw me off, so I wouldn't know which one was his. But
I see. Maybe he's worried that the government's going to close in on him again. And you said that obviously that he doesn't want contact via Facebook and have it as a profile because it connects the dots a little bit too much from his comfortable zone, I suppose.
Right. Yeah, I think that's what happened, because he did tell me that he didn't want to meet with me right now until things quiet down, because he said they're watching me right now.
Now, why would you, I mean, have you had any visits from people similar people, limousines and strange people turning up at your door?
Not that I remember, no.
Ah, okay. That's interesting. Maybe it's because he's been on that extra long journey to the base, supposedly. But then again, you've all had some fascinating experiences. He had more abduction experiences. Did he talk about those to you?
He did. He had one abduction that took place in St. Catharines near Cushman Road. That's kind of an industrial area. There's a lot of factories out that way. And he claimed that they abducted him in front of some people that actually saw this. They saw him being taken up into the ship. And And when they dropped him off again, he said they dropped him off, and some people saw the ship, and they saw him being dropped off. And so, yeah, he's got some interesting stories. Some of them sound like, even to me, they sound a little hard to believe. But I know my own story sounds kind of bizarre to begin with, so I can't really judge him, you know.
Yeah. I mean, what was the story that you found hard to believe? Can you remember that one?
Well, just that this ship, he said, it's one of the biggest ships he's ever seen. And he said it dropped him off in the area of Cushman Road, and other people saw it. And I kind of wondered, well, why wasn't this put in the paper? Why didn't anybody mention that they'd seen this ship in the area or anything? There was no other corroboration for it. So,
yeah, they're kind of. I was wondering that actually when you were saying that the fact that they're kind of being a bit open about it, dropping him off in an industrial state where there's plenty of people to witness such things. So maybe that's almost intentional, that they're not waiting for him to hitchhike down a lonely road somewhere. They're actually coming out in almost in plain sight to be observed. It's almost as if they want to be seen.
Yeah. Well, this area, though, it's kind of an area of factories, and I'm not sure when the abduction occurred that he was talking about. But if it occurred on the weekend, then all those factories would probably be closed, and there wouldn't be a lot of people around there. I've gone through that area many times, and there isn't a lot of traffic, but there are some people, you see.
Yeah. And what year would that be, approximately, then, that he was abducted?
I couldn't tell you. I'd have to go back and check my records, and I don't have that handy right now.
Okay. So did you have further abductions with your band or by yourself later on?
Yes, there was another abduction that took place that was almost as weird as the first one. And it was with the same band. We had a gig we were playing at a pub at Brock University. And the pub was called Alfie's Trough, and it was a very busy place for Brock students on the weekends. A lot of them would head over to the pub. And so we were playing there, I think it was on a Saturday. And we pulled up to the parking lot, and the guitarist had this kind of a wagon, like a dolly kind of thing on wheels. And we would pile all the drums and all the equipment, the amps and the heavy stuff on the dolly, and we'd pull it. It had a rope. And so we did that. We piled the stuff on, and we went into the front entrance of Brock University. And there's a big long hallway, and I'd been in Brock many times, and I knew where we were going, and I knew that the pub was in the back. And so as we were going down this long hallway, I noticed at the end of the hallway there were a couple of weird-looking beings walking around that looked like grays. And I pointed it out to the guys. I said, "Did you see that?" I said, "It looked like aliens down at the end of the hallway there." And they said, "Yeah." And they thought that was kind of weird. One of them looked at us, and when he saw us, he ducked into this door that I know led down into kind of a classroom in an amphitheater with a stage, because I'd seen a play there once before. So I knew what was inside that room. And I thought, when we get up to the end there, I'm going to open the door and look in and see if I can see him. So we got up to near the end of it, and I opened the door and I look in, and it was pitch black. You couldn't see anything. So I just shut the door, and we walked around the corner. And as soon as we came around the corner, they were there. There was, I'm not sure if there was 3 or 4 of them, but they immediately separated us from each other. And The guitarist's girlfriend, Anne Marie, let out a bit of a scream when they separated her from us. And they started interrogating us. And the one that was with me said, "Where are you going?" And I said, "We're going to the pub down here. We have to play. We're musicians and we have to play there tonight." And he said, "Oh," he said, "is this something you're going to be paid for?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Then you'll be missed." And I said, "Yes." So he turned to the others and told them, he said, "We have to let them go. They'll be missed." And all this was telepathic. So when he told them that, they assembled us together with our equipment, and he said, "When you go out the door, you'll forget everything. You won't remember any of it." So as soon as we walked out the door, sure enough, we forgot completely about it, and we headed on our way to the pub, which was in a separate building in the back. And so when we got to the building, there was like a bit of a staircase, and we walked up the staircase and banged on the door of the pub. And as we were waiting there, I happened to glance over the side of the railing, and I saw one of the beings run, kind of move around quickly around the side of the building and disappear. And I said, "Hey, did you see that?" And Anne Marie, the girl that was with us, she saw it. She said, "Yes, I saw that." And so then the door opened to the pub, and we didn't think anything more of it after that. And we walked inside, and we started to set up our equipment, and we waited for a little while, and nobody came in. So we had an agreement to start at a certain time, and so we went up and we played a set basically for just the bar staff. Mm-hmm. And when we finished the set, nobody had come in, and so we sat down and had a couple of drafts. And when the bartender came over, we said, "What time does it usually get busy around here?" And he said, "Well," he said, "they should be rolling in any time." He says, "I'm surprised that nobody's here yet." So we waited, and then we finally got up and played another set, and nobody had come in. And after the second set, there was still nobody there, and we waited for quite a while, and nobody showed up. And so we said to the bartender, like, "Where is everybody?" And he says, "I have no idea." He said, "This is really strange," because he says, "Normally this place is packed at this time of night." And he said, "Did you guys do anything to piss off your audience at the last gig, or, you know?" And we said, "No." And he says, "Well," he says, "I don't understand it. It's weird." And so we waited and nobody showed up. And finally he came over and he said, "Listen," he said, "I don't understand what's going on. I don't know where everybody is." But he said, "Obviously nobody's going to show up tonight for some reason." So he said, "I'll pay you guys for showing up." But he said, I apologize that there's no audience." He says, "I don't understand what happened." And so we started packing up our gear. And the guitarist came over to me, and he handed me his keys, and he said, "Can you go back to the van and get the wagon and bring it so we can pile the equipment on?" And I said, "Okay." And so he had taken the wagon back to the van earlier after we unloaded our stuff. And so I said, "Okay." So I took his keys and I started heading back into the back door of Brock University to go to the van and get the wagon. And I had had a couple of draft, and I was needing to use the washroom. So I wasn't sure where the washroom was. So I took a detour, and I went down one of the side hallways. I knew there must be a washroom down there somewhere. And I walked down the hallway and turned right. And as soon as I turned the corner, there was about 150 to 200 people all standing in the hallway, just standing there in a lineup, not saying anything, not talking. And so I walked up to this girl in the lineup and I said, what are you guys all doing here? And she said, well, the men told us to wait here and not to talk to each other, just to stay and stand here and wait. And I said, what men? And she said, well, there were some men here earlier that they come and take us a few at a time, and we have to wait for our turn. And I thought this was really weird. So I found the washroom and I went in, and after I came out of the washroom, they were still standing there. And I was going to go back up to this girl and talk to her again when I saw somebody come in through the back door. And it was a man. And he looked at me and he said, you there, you were told to stand in the lineup with the others and not to talk, just to stay in the lineup there. And I said, no. I said, you don't understand. I'm not part of this. And he said, well, you're part of it now. So stand in the lineup with the others and don't talk to each other. And I said, I can't. I said, I have to go and get the wagon so my band can pack up their stuff. I've got to go. And he realized he wasn't getting anywhere with me. And he said, well, then I'll have to take you right now then. Can you come with me? And I said, well, if it doesn't take too long, because I was kind of curious, like what was going on here. Mm-hmm. So I followed him out the door in the back of Brock University. This was a different door a little further down. And the ground was all covered with snow. And in the snow, I could see hundreds of footprints all heading toward the corner of the building. And he was taking me in that direction. And I could see all these footprints in the snow. And I looked at him. And as I was looking at him, he was starting to look less and less like a human and more like a gray alien. Mm-hmm. And I thought, this is really weird. Like, what's going on here? So when we came around the corner of the building, there was this saucer-shaped craft sitting on the tarmac, on the pavement behind the building. There was a ramp going up to the doorway, and the doorway arch was open, and there was lights inside. And he started to take me up this archway into the ship. So when we got up to the archway, a woman came to the archway, and she was dressed in a Red Cross nurse's uniform. And he said to her, "Can you take this one now?" And she said, "No, I can't take him now." She says, "I've got too many people in here as it is." And he said, "Well, he has to go somewhere. He can't stay. So can you fit him in?" And she said, "No, I can't take him now." And he said, "Well, what do you want me to do with him?" And she said, "I don't know. Take him where he's got to go." So I thought this was really strange. And so we walked back down the ramp. And he said to me,
"Steve, just to ask, the person in the uniform, this was a human in a nurse uniform?"
Yes.
So a Red Cross. And were there other humans around in kind of military dress?
No, I didn't see any. Just this woman.
So it was just her.
Yeah.
Mm.
And so when we got to the bottom of the ramp, he said, "Where do you need to go?" And I said, "Well, I was supposed to go and get the dolly or the wagon so we could load our equipment, but the guys are going to wonder where I am because it's taking too long." So I said, "I think I better walk back to the bar and tell them what happened," and that, you know, and so he started to take me down the road toward the bar. And I said, "They're going to be really mad at me when we get back there." So I said, "Can you come with me and explain what happened?" And he said, no, I'm sorry, I can't do that. They need me. I've got to go back. And I said, well, can you at least stand over by the tree here? Because I could see the van. It was parked in the back of the university by another set of doors, and the guys were loading the equipment in. And I said, they're going to be really mad at me. So I said, he refused to come with me. So I said, well, will you at least stand here so I can point to you and tell them that I was with you? And he said, yes, I'll do that. So he stood there by this tree, and there was a fence along the back there. And I walked over to them, and my nickname was Boucher. My name is really pronounced Boucher, but they called me Boucher. That was my nickname. And they said, Bouch, where were you? We were looking all over for you. And they said, we were going to leave without you. And they were pretty mad. And the drummer said, he said, if we hadn't had another set of keys hidden on the van, we wouldn't have been able to get in. And we needed to find you, so, you know. And he said, we were going to leave without you. And I said, well, I was with that guy over there. And I pointed over to the being that was standing by the tree. And as I was pointing to him, I could see his image fading and disappearing. And they looked over and they said, what guy? And I said, the guy over there by the tree. And they said, there's nobody there. They said, what are you talking about? And I said, well, it was some kind of an alien that when I went back in, and they said, oh, Boucher. They said, what are you trying to give us this lame story? Like, you know, come on, you really expect us to believe that? And I said, it's true, I'm serious. There was some aliens, and one of them took me, and they didn't want to hear it. They didn't want to hear it at all. They were really angry with me, and I was so upset. I felt terrible, and the band ended up breaking up shortly after that.
That's interesting because they had already seen these aliens in this building prior to your gig. And here they were denying the validity of what you were describing to them. I mean, which was a perfectly, given the situation and their previous experience, it was a perfectly reasonable reason for being late.
That's right. But in the first encounter that we had with them, where they separated us, they told us that as soon as you go out this door, you're going to forget everything that happened. And we did. Because when we got to the bar and I looked over the rail and I saw one of these beings, I said, oh, look, there looks like some kind of an alien down there or something. I had even forgotten. Like they wipe your memory so you can't remember. And I wish they wouldn't do that, because every time you have a subsequent visitation from them, it feels like the first time again. And you feel that initial fear all over again, you know?
And so when you was taken to the base of this craft and you said a lady came to the door dressed in that uniform, do you think that was a grey masquerading as a lady, possibly, like the man was?
I suspect it was, yeah.
Yeah, and it's just an extraordinary tale, the fact that they were trying to do a mass abduction on like 150 people plus, doing 5, 10 at a time, whatever the number may be, and she was full up to the hilt with them, and they obviously were trying to get through them.
It came to occur to me when I saw all these people standing there that this was our audience.
Yeah.
This was why nobody was showing up at the bar, because they were grabbing them as they were coming in, and they were lining them all up in this lineup. And I don't know what they were taking them on the ship for, but
they're being greedy, taking too many at once. My God.
Yeah.
But it is interesting. It connects your band though to them as well. They followed you or tracked you or something, and then they decide to grab all those other people as well.
Yeah, well, I think that was around the time in 1971 that there was a UFO flap where there was a lot of sightings and a lot of stuff happening. And because it was so close to Lake Ontario, I think that was a separate incident that we walked in on. I don't think it was meant aimed at me or aimed at the band. I think it was just another incident that we stumbled upon.
Crikey.
Yeah.
Steve, throughout all of this, did you ever find out what they were doing this for? Did they ever elaborate, or have they always been mysterious about this?
What they were doing with all those people, you mean?
The whole thing, the testing, the taking people on board the ship, the procedures, did they ever elaborate in terms of why they were doing it and, what their aims were?
No, they didn't tell us, but strangely enough, the hitchhiker thinks when he heard that story, he said that he thought that he might have been there that night because he'd gone to that bar before.
Mm.
And he seems to remember vaguely that people were talking about aliens and a UFO. So I don't know how much of that I can believe. But, I'm wondering if out of all those people, there's got to be somebody that remembers that night.
Yeah. Statistically, 150 people. There's got to be a few that might have had a not such deep trance to forget or something.
So that's why I've mentioned it here, and I've mentioned it in a couple of other videos that I've made that are on YouTube, hoping that somebody will remember that night and will come forward and contact me.
Well, if there's anyone listening that does remember something about that incident or knows someone that's connected with the incident, where is the town that took place? Was that still St. Catherine's?
Yes.
So, and what was the name of the university?
Brock University.
In 1971, you think? And it was a gig there at the pub at the university grounds.
Well, I'm not sure if that one was 1971. I know the first one was 1971 because the guitarist kept a logbook of the gigs that we played.
Right.
And that date appeared in there. But at the time, I didn't know about the second incident where our audience was abducted. So we didn't look for a date for that gig in the logbook. So it could have been anywhere from 1971 to 73, or possibly even later. I think the band was only together for about 3 years.
Right. Okay. But certainly it's unusual for the barman to sort of say, we've got no audience tonight. This is really weird. I don't know why. So that would be an unusual experience from their point of view. And if there's anyone that worked at that bar at that time, they would probably remember that. And of course, they weren't entranced or put under in some way. So I also kind of wondered what happened to the guitarist when he took the wagon back to the vehicle, if they got him again when he went back in or not. Yeah. So no one knows what they were doing, but they obviously got this, by the sounds of it, a presence at Lake Ontario, and they must be doing local abductions around that area, taking DNA, I'm assuming, blood samples or whatever, of that local populace around there. And they don't have to travel back to their star. This has always been the argument. Why do they keep coming back all that distance? And I said, no, they don't, because they've got a local base there, just like an American or government might set up a base in Afghanistan, that kind of thing. It's they set up these local pockets where they can do whatever they need to do, which makes a hell of a lot of sense. One of the things that interests me particularly, two things actually, is that I don't know if you're familiar with the Betty and Barney Hill case, are you?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Now, all the stories generally that I hear round about now of Greys have always been negative, but that seemed to be one of the earliest discussions about Greys, going back to about, I think it was 1961, I think that case took. And they were coming down from Canada through Medicine Hat, I believe the town was called, or that area was Medicine Hat, back into somewhere in the United States, New Hampshire. I don't know my geography well of that area.
It was New Hampshire.
New Hampshire, yeah. And they arrived about 4 a.m., 5 a.m., something like that, but they were missing some time. And that's subsequently how they discovered that they'd been abducted. And what struck me is that I recall them saying that these beings, and they didn't call them greys then, but the way they described them obviously translates to our present understanding that we call them greys. They had uniforms like you described them. And I wonder if it was part of the same, the same team of greys, if you like, that might have taken them.
It's possible. I suspect that the ones that abducted me came from Orion, whereas Betty Hill had reconstructed a copy of the star map that they showed her, and I think they were from Zeta Reticuli or somewhere around there.
Yeah.
So I don't think they were the same group. There's different types of greys.
Yeah. Now, what made you think those ones that you had dealings with comes from Orion?
It's hard to say. I think I just have a very strong feeling that's where they came from. But it could have also been the star map that he pointed to. I could be remembering the 3 stars in the belt of Orion. And also that the being that I call the leader, I call him the commander, and his name I remember being Rigel.
Yeah.
So, but I suspect that the beings that abducted me were from Orion. I have no proof of that or no way to verify it, but I feel strongly that that's where they were from.
Now, it's interesting. What comes to mind as you say that about Orion was the book called The Orion Mystery, which was, I think, by Graham Hancock and Adrian Gilbert about 20 plus years ago, where they actually study the pyramids at Giza in Egypt. And they sort of basically said that it's a star map. I think Robert Vaval was also involved. I actually used to know him many years ago.
That was actually his theory.
Yeah, that's right. Where the 3 pyramids, and one is slightly off. They're not quite in perfect alignment. One's just slightly off, just in the same way the stars of Orion's belt, one is slightly off. And so they're saying that the pyramids represent a star map on the ground of Orion's belt. And one of the stars shines its light or something down one of these, the Queen's shaft or something like that, going down into the pyramid. Or it did 4,500 years ago because the Earth wobbles on its axis and it lined up better then or something. So I'm wondering if that's a connection there. Just something I thought I'll throw in. I don't know much about the pyramids, so it's just a little thing that just rattled a few memory cells there that connects up maybe a few dots on that. Maybe the ancient Egyptians maybe did have early contact with those particular brand of greys or something. Obviously, from their point of view, the Orion star system seemed to have some importance to them for some reason. So it might tie up with that. And the other point I was going to make is that, and this also comes from the other abductions I've been reading about. I mean, I'm Betty and Barney Hill. I know that they put their fingers down into his mouth and took out his false teeth, and they tried to do the same with Betty, and they couldn't understand why her teeth wouldn't come out. It's because Barney had false teeth and Betty didn't.
Yeah.
And other examples where aliens or greys have abducted people, and I'm trying to think of the Pascagoula case, where the guy there, I forget his name now, has a bit of a fight, and they stick their fingers down his throat. And I'm thinking, with all this coronavirus now being on everyone's minds, and you've got to stand 2 meters apart and wear a mask and that kind of stuff, we're all going to be highly infectious to each other, is that these aliens don't seem to bother about any potential infection that they can either give us or that we might give them. It's almost as if it doesn't even enter their thought patterns at all. They're not worried about that. Has that ever crossed your mind at all?
Yeah, especially when the one put the recorder that I handed him up to his nostrils.
Yeah,
thought,
yeah.
It was like that was perfectly natural for them, and they didn't think anything of it. But to me, it seemed really strange because I didn't know about the difference in their physiology. The Pascagoula case, I think was Calvin Parker. Charles
That's correct.
Hickson?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, that's about 1973, I believe, which was also witnessed by. Since that time, many other witnesses have come forward. People that were around that area, either working on the dockyards or in vehicles opposite them. They saw the flying saucer come down and stuff. So yeah, that got quite a few witnesses as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Charles Hickson passed away, but Calvin Parker is actually one of my Facebook friends.
Yeah, I've seen him on Facebook. I've seen him as a friend suggestion. I didn't want to kind of add him, but not being rude to the guy, but I thought he's probably got enough people queuing up to add him, so I thought I'll respectfully leave him alone because he's done enough interviews. I think, I don't want to sort of ask him to repeat himself for the 100th time or something. So, but I mean, you must get fed up telling the same story time and time again. Has any more memories come forward for you that weren't apparent the first time that you started to relive these? Has other things surfaced since then?
Oh yeah, there's been quite a few memories, and I've tried to put everything that I can remember of all the incidents in my book, and it's being published by Grant Cameron's publishing company, and that'll be out on Amazon. Hopefully it won't take more than a month now, because I finished the final proofreading and I have a cover for it and all that. And I built a new website. I've got a domain with a new website on there that shows the book. There's a section where you can view all the videos that I've done on YouTube and my artwork and also my music. And that's called experiencer.ca.
Okay, that's great. And what's the title of your book again?
It's called Beyond the Extraterrestrial Firewall.
Okay.
And then the subtitle is An Experiencer's Point of View.
Now, it's interesting you call it the extraterrestrial firewall. What are you kind of referring to? That you've broken through their defenses in some way?
Well, yeah, in a sense. The firewall it's actually what I, for years, had called the veil. And it's the veil between the subconscious mind and the conscious mind. And it's also the veil that separates our 3D reality from the other levels, like 4D and 5D. And this veil is, I believe that the beings are actually, more than being extraterrestrial, they're interdimensional. And they actually reside on the other side of this veil. So they can see us, but we can't see them. And then once this happened to me, I started getting an interest in all kinds of subjects like spirituality, quantum physics. I read David Bohm's book, Wholeness in the Implicate Order, and Michael Talbot's book, The Holographic Universe. And I started to focus on this idea that if we are in fact living in a holographic universe, then you could think of that veil as a firewall, in terms of a computer simulation. If we're living in a computer simulation, then that veil is actually a firewall that separates them from our 3D reality. And so that's what gave me the idea for the title.
It's a great title. Now, do you think that Betty and Barney Hill, she might have seen the different aliens or the different greys, and you think that these are a different brand? I mean, by all accounts, the greys that you encountered, especially the one where you're in the back of the van, they seem to be actually quite pleasant to you and actually quite accommodating to you, and you came to no harm from what we can tell. Whereas other people have had some really bad experiences with greys, but they must be like a different fraction or something.
Well, I'm not sure, because I've had some unpleasant experiences with them as well.
Oh,
and
right.
Steve, when you say them and unpleasant experiences, do you think it was the same lot, or do you think it was a different lot?
It's hard to say. I think it could have been a different lot, because that was another incident where I stumbled into their presence. I don't think it was planned for them to abduct me at that time. I think it was just something that I stumbled into that
Can you explain? Can you elaborate on that and explain that one a bit better?
Well, I was going with a girl at that time that I give her the pseudonym Cindy to protect her identity. But anyway, I was dating this girl, and her parents didn't like me much for some reason, and they used to follow us in their pickup truck and spy on us. And
paranoid.
We'd see, we'd come out of someplace downtown. We'd see the pickup truck parked a couple of blocks down, and we knew that they were watching us. And so one day they were tearing down this old Wallace's building, I think it was, or anyway, it was an old building downtown, and they were tearing it down to make room for this big superstructure they were going to put up called the core block. And there was this building was in what is now the core block parking lot, and they had it boarded off with plywood going around so you couldn't get in there. And we were walking along. It was kind of cold, and I noticed one of the pieces of plywood that were nailed up was loose, and I pulled it aside and looked inside, and it was it was late in the day, but it was still fairly light out. And so we were able to fit in there. So I thought, well, let's go in there for a bit. So we went in through the opening in the plywood, and with the intention of making out. And there was a big metal desk sitting in the middle of the floor there, and it looked like up above there was kind of a promenade that overlooked the lower floor. And so we went and sat on the desk, and we were kissing and stuff, and then I happened to glance up, and I saw something move up on the promenade. And it was hidden in the darkness, but I could see something move up there. And I said, "There's somebody up there." And Cindy said, "No, there's nobody up there. There's just you and me here." And I said, "No, I saw something move up there." And so anyway, she managed to get my mind off it. And then just out of nowhere, these beings all came out of the darkness and approached us. And we were going to run, and all of a sudden I felt myself paralyzed, and I fell on the floor, and my head was turned so that I could see the bottom of the desk, and I could see these beings going around Cindy, and she was yelling for me to help her, and I couldn't move. I couldn't do anything, and they basically got her on the desk, and I don't know what they did, but they took her clothes off, and I was trying to move, and she kept calling me, and I couldn't move. And then finally I could move after a while, and one of the beings came over and took us to the area where the plywood was loose, and told us that when we got onto the other side, we wouldn't remember anything. We'd completely forget once we left. So we walked through. I went through first, and then Cindy came through, and I took her hand to help her come through. And I looked, and I saw this being there, and I said, "Hey, there's somebody in there." I'd already forgotten. And when she came out, she said, "No, there was nobody in there, just you and me." And so it was pretty late by this time. I don't know if we had missing time or what, but I decided to take her home. So I took her home, dropped her off, and she went in. And then the next day, when I was talking to her on the phone, she said, when I came in last night, I took my coat off and hung it up. And she said, my blouse was all buttoned wrong and it was sticking out of the back of my skirt. And my parents were sitting on the couch and they must have seen that when I ran up the stairs to my room. And I know that I am not that careless, that there's no way that I would send her home in that condition like that, you know. So it was kind of I'm assuming it was a scramble to get her together and get us out of there. And they didn't pay any attention to make sure that everything was done up right. They just got us out, you know.
That's interesting. Yeah, I've heard other cases where people come out wearing other people's outfits and things, or T-shirts and things.
Yeah.
Because they just dress them in the wrong clothes. They don't understand those little social parts of our behavior. Fascinating. Well,
So
I'm afraid
that was an unpleasant part.
an
That was
unpleasant
one of the
part.
unpleasant
Yeah.
parts. Yeah.
I'm afraid we've got to draw our chat to a close because we've run out of time. But it's absolutely been a fascinating couple of hours, Steve. And just like to say from myself and Andy, thank you so much indeed for taking the time out to share your absolutely fascinating experiences. So for everybody listening, we've been chatting to Steve Boucher in Canada about his abduction experiences with Greys, and he's got his book Beyond the Alien Firewall. Is that right?
No, Beyond the Extraterrestrial
Firewall, beg your pardon.
Yeah.
And he's also got his website out there for anybody that wants to check that out, and it's experiencer.ca. Is that right?
Correct.
Yeah, wow, I got that bit right. So check that website out, and you'll be able to find details of Steve's forthcoming book, which is it due out about now? Roughly.
Yes, I finished the final proofread, and I'm just working it out with them now to get the spine made for the cover.
Okay, so we're talking September time, October time. Certainly by September, I'm sure it'll be out available on Amazon for anybody that wants to check that out. And if anyone has any further information that might be of assistance to Steve with filling in missing parts of his jigsaw, please do get in touch with him via his website. I'm sure he's got an email there that you can contact him. Is that right?
I don't know if I put it on, but I'll make sure there is one.
Yeah, that'd be great for anyone that wants to follow it up, and if they want to kind of contact you, I'm sure that you might get a bit of interest from certainly our interview with you. Anyway,
Yeah.
Andy, any last words, Andy, before we go?
I think we're only just scratching the surface of
Yeah,
this. I think this is
absolutely.
far more widespread than people realise.
Yeah,
And I wish more people would kind of either speak up or kind of realise what's going on, maybe question what's gone on in their life. And it would be great to have Steve back and hear about some more experiences if there are.
yeah. When you got some more experiences rise to the surface or something, or more hypnosis sessions, we'd love to have you back. Or maybe some of our colleagues would love to interview you further as well on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. So anyway, thank you very much indeed for taking part. You're listening to Andy and Neil on the Paranormal UK Radio Network with the Paranormal Peep Show. Join us again next month where you can hear some more fascinating tales of the paranormal. Good night all.
Thank you
Take
so
care,
much for
everyone.
having me.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you. Good night all.
Good night.